Hello, y'all. It's Dr. G, and welcome back to Star-Spangled Studies. Picture this: Philadelphia, July 4th, 1788. A grand federal procession fills the street to celebrate the brand new United States Constitution. It's a spectacle of national hope. Workers from every trade are marching. Blacksmiths have set up a working forge on a float, and instead of making weapons, they're symbolically beating swords into farm tools. Potters march proudly behind the sign that paraphrases the Bible, quote, "The potter hath power over his clay," linking God's power and artisan's skill and a citizen's control over their own country. In a powerful display of religious pluralism, Christian clergymen march arm in arm with Jewish rabbis. This parade was a living, breathing vision of what many Americans hoped the United States would become: a diverse but cohesive, prosperous, and most of all, a unified nation. But just a few years earlier, this scene would have seemed like impossible fantasy. The new nation, fresh from its improbable victory over the British Empire, was teetering on the brink of collapse. The government was broke, states were fighting with one another like they were angry siblings, and farmers, of all people, were taking up rebellious arms against their own government. So, what happened in that chaotic decade between the end of the Revolution and this grand parade? Was this truly America's critical period, the time of chaos and despair that nearly destroyed the country before it even began? Or was the story itself a kind of propaganda, a narrative crafted to justify a radical, and some would say counter-revolutionary, new type of government? Today, we're going to dive into that turbulent, messy, and absolutely crucial decade when the United States almost wasn't. This is the story of a new nation and the fight for its very soul. So let's go. So, to understand this story, we need to really start with the first government of the United States, and that was based on the Articles of Confederation. Now, if you've taken your high school civics class, you probably already heard that the Articles were a total failure. And yes, they had major problems. I mean, holes in the Titanic type of problems. But it's crucial to remember that the Articles were weak on purpose. That was by design. The United States had just fought a revolution against a powerful centralized government, that of King George and Parliament. And the last thing that they wanted was to create another centralized, powerful government. So they designed the Articles of Confederation not as a national government, but as a, quote, league of friendship, a league of friendship between 13 sovereign, independent states. Congress was the main body, but it had no president, it had no national court system. It was, as I said, independent. Each state, no matter its size, had one vote, and the weaknesses of this system were glaring. Congress couldn't levy taxes directly, it could only request money from the states, which they often refused to pay, and you probably would too. It couldn't regulate interstate commerce, so states started getting into trade wars with one another, slapping tariffs on goods from their neighbors. And if you wanted to change the Articles of Confederation, you needed a unanimous vote from all 13 states. When was the last time anything was really that unanimous when it comes to politics? So you get to see why this was an absolute failure. And for a time, the dominant narrative, first powerfully articulated by the historian John Fiske in 1888, was that this weakness led to the disaster. So Fiske was writing in the late 19th century when the nation was still recovering from the Civil War. And this painted the picture of the 1780s as a time of utter chaos and economic depression and political ineptitude. And in his view, the country was on the verge of anarchy, saved only by the heroic intervention of the founding fathers who drafted the Constitution. He called it, quote, the most critical moment in all the history of the American people, end quote. But that's not really the whole story, though, right? By the mid-20th century, a new school of historians led by Merrill Jensen began to push back on this. Jensen, in his landmark book, The New Nation, argued that the critical period wasn't so critical after all. He saw the 1780s not as a decade of chaos and failure, but of hopeful striving. Those were his words. He pointed to the successes of the Confederation Congress, like establishing a bureaucracy, dealing with war debt, and most importantly, passing the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, which created a process for admitting new states, and it famously banned slavery in the new territories. Jensen argued that the chaos narrative was largely propaganda, and it was created by a small but powerful group of wealthy nationalists at the time. The merchants, the banks and bondholders, the large landowners, who wanted a central government to protect their economic interests. They weren't saving the country from anarchy, that wasn't their goal. They were staging a counter-revolution against the more radical democratic impulses of the American Revolution itself. This debate between Fisk and Jensen's schools shows us something vital about history. The story we tell about the past is often shaped by the concerns of the present. Fisk's narrative served to glorify the Constitution and national unity. Jensen's narrative forced us to ask who really benefited from that Constitution. The truth, as always, is somewhere in the middle, in the complex story of events like Shays' Rebellion. If there's one event that embodies the tensions of the 1780s, it's Shays' Rebellion. In western Massachusetts, farmers, many of them were veterans of the Revolutionary War, found themselves in a very desperate situation. They were being crushed by personal debts as well as high state taxes, levied because the state of Massachusetts needed to pay off the war debt that was being held by wealthy merchants in Boston. And to make matters worse, there was a shortage of hard currency, but creditors and tax collectors would only accept cash. When farmers couldn't pay, they faced foreclosure on their farms. Not only their farms, but their land, their tools, their livestock, all of this was seized. And as one petition from a group of farmers put it, quote, "The present expensive mode of collecting debts will of necessity fill our jails with unhappy debtors," end quote. So what did they do? They did what they had learned to do during the Revolution. They organized, they held conventions, they petitioned the government for relief, and when the government in Boston ignored them, they took up arms. Sounds like a very familiar story. They were led by a fellow veteran, a man, Captain Daniel Shays, and they marched on the county courthouses to shut them down and stop the foreclosures. In their minds, they weren't rebels, they were patriots. They called themselves the regulators, and they believed they were protecting their rights and acting in the true, quote, spirit of 1776. But to the nation's elites, this was terrifying. This wasn't a protest against some distant king. This was an uprising, an armed uprising, and a rebellion against a Republican government, not some monarchy across the ocean. George Washington, who had retired to Mount Vernon, was horrified. He wrote to his friend Henry Knox, a general who had been there to observe the situation, quote, "If 3 years ago any person had told me that at this day I should see such a formidable rebellion against the laws and constitutions of our own making as now appears, I should have thought him a bedlamite, a fit subject for a madhouse," end quote. To another friend, he worried that, quote, "commotions of this sort, like snowballs, gather strength as they roll, if there is no opposition in the way to divide and crumble them," end quote. The rebellion was ultimately crushed by the state militia, funded by the same very wealthy Boston merchants. But the shock waves of Shays' Rebellion sent across these 13 states were immense. It convinced elite men like Washington and others, like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, that the Articles of Confederation were too weak to maintain order. The government couldn't protect its own federal arsenal from a mob of angry farmers, and that, in their eyes, meant there really was no government at all. The rebellion, once over, showed that even though the farmers had lost, their uprising terrified the nation's elites into action. They would now gather in Philadelphia not to tweak the government, but to tear it down and build something entirely new. But what would that look like, and who would it serve? That's the questions we're going to answer next. After Shays' rebellion was crushed in Massachusetts, the founding fathers were left finding a solution to make sure that this never happened again. They decided to meet in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. The official story was that they were there to revise the Articles of Confederation, but in reality, they were planning a peaceful overthrow of the United States government, so to speak. The delegates who gathered in Philadelphia were instructed only to amend the Articles, but some men there, like James Madison, came with a bigger agenda. Madison himself was a brilliant political theorist, and he arrived with a plan already in his pocket. This was the Virginia Plan, which outlined a powerful new national government to completely replace the old one. The convention met in secret with the window shut tight in the sweltering summer heat. The stench must have been terrible. And they did this to shield their radical debates from public hearing and eyes. The debates were intense. The large states favored Madison's Virginia plan with representation based on the population of your state. But the small states, obviously being smaller, didn't like a plan where they would be outnumbered. And so they countered with what was called the New Jersey Plan, which demanded equal representation for every state. This was the deadlock, and eventually it was broken by what has been called the Great Compromise, creating what we have today, the bicameral legislature, a House based on population, and a Senate with equal representation for each state. They argued fiercely over another topic, the nature of the executive branch. After fighting a war to escape a king, the idea of a powerful singular person, the president, was deeply controversial, and it conjured up images of an elected monarchy. They debated how the president would be chosen, how long would they serve, and what powers they would ultimately have. And they eventually settled on creating the Electoral College and a system of checks and balances. But perhaps the most divisive and morally compromising debate of all was over the institution of slavery. Yes, they argued about it here too. This wasn't just a political disagreement. This was a raw conflict over the fundamental character of a new nation supposedly built on liberty. And thanks to Madison's meticulous notes, we have a front row seat to the drama. On one side were delegates like Gouverneur Morris from Pennsylvania, who called slavery, quote, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed, end quote. George Mason, a slaveholder himself from Virginia, said this about slavery, quote, slavery discourages arts and manufactures. The poor despise labor when performed by slaves. They prevent the immigration of whites who really enrich and strengthen the country. They produce the most pernicious effect on manners. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country, end quote. But delegates from the Deep South were just as adamant. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina stated it bluntly, quote, South Carolina can never receive the plan if it prohibits the slave trade, end quote. His cousin, General Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, was even more direct, warning that, quote, South Carolina and Georgia cannot do without slaves. The people of those states will never be such fools as to give up so important an interest, end quote. The result is what we historians call the dirty compromise. To keep the southern states in the Union, the northern delegates agreed to three major concessions on slavery. The first is the infamous 3/5 clause, which counted 3/5 of enslaved population for the purposes of representation in Congress. So lopsided was this power that 9 of the first 11 presidents of the United States were slave owners, or from slave states. The second was a clause preventing Congress from banning the international slave trade for 20 years. The third was a fugitive slave clause that required the return of escaped enslaved people back to their enslavers. This brings us to another great historical debate. Was the Constitution a noble document forged from high minded ideals, or was it, as the historian Charles Beard argued in 1913, a document designed to protect the financial interests of a wealthy elite? Now, Beard's, at the time, progressive interpretation, which suggested the founders were more concerned with their bonds and land holdings than with the abstract ideal of liberty, that dominated the historical debate about this for decades. Later, historians like Gordon Wood would push back on this, re-emphasizing the power of Republican ideology, the genuine fear of tyranny and the commitment to liberty as those that animated the founders. And what the debates over slavery show us is that, well, both can be true. The convention was a clash of high minded ideals and raw, cynical self interests. The Constitution emerged as a document with profound principles, but also profound tragic compromises. And after this long, hot summer of debate, a new Constitution was born. But getting 55 men in a room to agree on it was actually the easy part. Now they had to convince 13 states and millions of Americans to accept this radical new government. The result was a war of words that would define the very soul of the nation. So the year is 1787, and the new Constitution has been sent to the states for ratification. And the American people are now faced with a monumental choice: embrace this new powerful central government or reject it. The debate that followed was one of the most brilliant and possibly consequential in world history, carried out in newspapers, in pamphlets, and in ratifying conventions across these United States. On the one side were the Federalists. These were those who supported the Constitution. They were led by figures like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. They argued that a strong, energetic national government was essential for the nation's survival. Their most famous contribution was a series of 85 essays published in New York newspapers, and we know them today as the Federalist Papers. In Federalist number 10, Madison tackles the biggest fear of Republican government, the danger of factions, or what we might call special interest groups. The conventional wisdom, dating back to ancient Greece, was that republics could only work in small, homogeneous societies. Madison turned this idea on its head. He argued that the real danger came from a majority faction opposing the minority. In a large, diverse republic like the United States, he wrote, there would be so many different factions, farmers, merchants, creditors, debtors, that no single one could ever dominate. As he would write in Federalist 51, quote, ambition must be made to counter ambition, end quote. It was brilliant, if nothing but counterintuitive, an argument for a large republic. On the other side were the Anti-Federalists, and it's important to remember that they weren't an organized party, but more of a diverse coalition of people who shared a common fear about the new Constitution. They feared that the new Constitution created a government that was too powerful, too distant from the lives of ordinary people, and that it was a direct threat to individual liberty, far away, like the king was. One of the more prominent Anti-Federalist writers used a pseudonym, Brutus, and it was likely the New York judge Robert Yates. Brutus argued that in a republic as vast as these United States, representatives would become disconnected from the people they were supposed to represent. The government would have to rely on a standing army to enforce its laws, which he called, quote, a government of all others the most to be dreaded, end quote. And the Anti-Federalists had powerful intellectual voices on their side, including women. Mercy Otis Warren, a celebrated poet and historian from Massachusetts, wrote a scathing critique called Observations on the New Constitution. She saw a tragic irony in what was happening. Americans had just risked their lives to escape a distant, centralized tyranny, and now, a mere decade later, they were willing to accept a new one. Ultimately, the Anti Federalists' most powerful and effective argument was that the Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights. There was no explicit protection for the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, or the freedom of religion. This became the key to ratification. In state after state, Federalists had promised that the very first act of the new government would be to pass a series of amendments protecting these fundamental liberties. This became known as the Massachusetts Compromise, and it broke the logjam, and the Constitution was eventually ratified. So now that the Constitution was ratified, the parades like the one in Philadelphia that we had mentioned at the start could begin. But the arguments about the Constitution didn't stop, and they continue to this day. The fundamental disagreements between those who feared anarchy and those who feared tyranny would now shape the new government from within, embodied in two titans of the founding generation. It would be Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, and their epic clash we'll get to next. With the Constitution now in place, George Washington was elected unanimously as the country's first president. His cabinet was a political wrestling match waiting to happen. In one corner, you had the brilliant, city-loving, ambitious Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. And in the other, you have the revolutionary icon, the slave-owning Virginia planter, and now the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. Their battle of wills wasn't just personal, it was a battle for the very soul of America. Hamilton had a bold vision for the new nation. He wanted to build a powerful, centralized state with a vibrant commercial and industrial economy, much like was seen in Great Britain. His financial plan had three key parts. First, the federal government would assume the massive war debts of the states. This would bind the nation's wealthiest creditors to the success of the national government. Second, he proposed the creation of a bank of the United States, a national bank that would then regulate currency, provide loans, and manage government finances. And third, in his report on manufactures, he had called for tariffs and subsidies to encourage the growth of American industries to try and break Britain's hold on manufacturing. Hamilton believed in the idea of a dynamic economy, and he felt that this was the key to national strength. He even argued that everything that had increased the, quote, total mass of industry and opulence is ultimately beneficial to every part of it, end quote. This plan by Hamilton horrified Jefferson. He envisioned a completely different form of liberty, what he called an empire of liberty, but not built on manufacturing or a centralized government or in cities. It was built on the foundation of independent yeoman farmers. He feared that Hamilton's plan would create a dependent class of factory workers, corrupt the nation with financial speculation, and concentrate power in the hands of wealthy urban elites. He argued that the creation of a national bank was in itself unconstitutional because the powers to create a bank was not explicitly granted to Congress in the Constitution itself. This fundamental disagreement from the very start, Hamilton's loose construction of the Constitution versus Jefferson's very strict construction, gave rise to the nation's first political parties. They were the Federalists, led by men like Hamilton, and then there were the Democratic Republicans led by Jefferson and Madison. The first major test of the new government's power came in 1794 with the Whiskey Rebellion. Hamilton's financial plan to get out of debt included an excise tax on whiskey, which was a critical part of the economy for Western Pennsylvania farmers. For them, whiskey was more than just a drink. It was a form of currency and a way to get their corn to market. They saw the tax as an attack by a distant Eastern government on their livelihoods, and they rebelled, and they tarred and feathered the tax collectors. The government's response was a world away from its reaction to what we saw in Shays' rebellion. Under the Articles, the government had been powerless. Under the Constitution, however, President Washington, urged on by Hamilton, personally led an army of 13,000 militiamen into western Pennsylvania to crush the rebellion. The rebels mostly scattered, but the message was clear. As Washington declared in a proclamation, the government would, quote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed, end quote. For Federalists, this was a triumphant success, proof that the new government could maintain order. For the Democratic Republicans, however, it was a terrifying display of federal power being used against its own citizens. These domestic divisions were amplified by new foreign crises. When the French Revolution descended into the Reign of Terror, Federalists recoiled in horror, while Republicans cheered what they saw as a sister revolution. The crisis escalated with the XYZ affair, where French officials demanded a bribe from American diplomats, leading to an undeclared naval war with France known as the Quasi-War. Fearing French spies and Republican dissent, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the infamous Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. These laws made it harder for immigrants to become citizens and made it a crime to, quote, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing, end quote, against the government. It was a direct assault on the freedom of speech and the press, and it was aimed squarely at silencing Republican newspapers and critics. In response, Jefferson and Madison secretly drafted the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These resolutions made the radical claim that states had the right to judge the constitutionality of federal laws, and if they found them unconstitutional, to declare them null and void. This was a direct challenge to federal authority and laid the groundwork for the states' rights arguments that would later lead to and justify for the South the Civil War. The Alien and Sedition Acts were a step too far. The Federalists had overplayed their hand, and so this set the stage for a political showdown coming up with the election of 1800, an election so bitter and transformative that Jefferson himself would call it another revolution. I want to start off by saying that the election of 1800 has been called one of the dirtiest campaigns in American history. Federalists painted Jefferson as a godless radical who would bring the terror of the French Revolution to American shores. Republicans portrayed President John Adams as a monarchist who wanted to crush liberty under the boat of a powerful central government. The result was a constitutional crisis. The Democratic Republican electors had cast their 2 votes for Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, resulting in a tie. Under the Constitution, the election was thrown into the House of Representatives, which was still controlled by the lame duck Federalists. For 35 ballots, the House was deadlocked. There was talk of military intervention, of secession, of even assassinations. The young republic seemed once again on the verge of splintering. Finally, Alexander Hamilton, who despised Jefferson but believed Burr himself was a man without principle, intervened and Jefferson was elected president. What happened next was actually truly revolutionary. Despite the bitter partisanship of this election, power was transferred peacefully from one rival party to another. This, Jefferson would later write, was the true, quote, revolution of 1800. In his inaugural address to the nation, Jefferson tried to heal the nation's wounds after that dirty 1800 election. Quote, but every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists, end quote. It was a beautiful sentiment, no doubt, but while a political revolution had occurred, the social revolution promised by the Declaration of Independence remained unfinished. Who was left out of this new nation? Well, women, for one. We can't forget Abigail Adams' prescient letter sent to her husband John in 1776 that we talked about last episode, urging him and the other founders to remember the ladies and to not put, quote, unlimited power into the hands of their husbands. John Adams, of course, laughed it off, and he told her, quote, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems, end quote. While the revolution opened up new roles for women in the concept of Republican motherhood, that being the idea that women's primary political role was to raise virtuous, patriotic sons, it did not grant them political or legal equality, something that would take another 100+ years. And of course, there were those that were enslaved. In the same year as Jefferson's Revolution, an enslaved blacksmith named Gabriel organized a massive rebellion in Virginia, planning to march on Richmond and demand liberty. The plot was discovered and brutally suppressed, but it was a terrifying reminder to white Virginians that the language of liberty and revolution was not lost on the very people that they held in bondage. Throughout the Revolutionary era, enslaved people continuously petitioned the legislatures for their freedom, powerfully using the colonists' own rhetoric against them. Despite all of this, there were genuine expansions of liberty. The revolution sparked a movement for religious freedom, culminating in the disestablishment of state-sponsored churches and the passage of Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom in 1786. Its powerful opening declared that, quote, Almighty God hath created the mind free, end quote. And this became a cornerstone of American liberty. So the 1780s and the 1790s were a period that forged a new, powerful, and deeply compromised nation. The Constitution created a double framework for a republic, but it papered over, rather than solved, the fundamental conflicts over federal versus state power, and the profound, glaring hypocrisy of a land of freedom built on a foundation of slavery. These were the tensions that would define the next century of American history. Jefferson's revolution was a victory for his vision of a limited agrarian republic, but in a twist of historical irony, his presidency would unleash forces of expansion and national power that challenged that very vision. And these are the topics of our next episode. So, I'm Dr. G, and I'll see y'all in the past.